The turret shook hard enough to make the brass rattle in the racks. Desmond Johnson's left arm stung where the recoil guard had grazed him, but there was no time to flinch. The 75mm gun had just fired, and the commander's voice was already echoing through the tank. Johnson reached for the next round, 38 kilograms of brass and steel, slick with oil. He lifted it from the ready rack by instinct. His wrist turned clockwise, same motion they'd drilled 100 times in training, the one written into the Army's manuals. But the casing caught on the breech lip, clanged off the guide, and skidded sideways. And smoke filled the turret. The gunner swore under his breath. The tank rocked from another incoming shell hitting close, shrapnel clattering against the hull. Johnson's chest tightened. He grabbed again, but the shell jammed once more. The Germans were firing faster than they were. That was the problem. Always had been. He stopped, breathing through the smoke. The metal of the round felt cold and heavy against his gloves. Without thinking, he flipped the shell the other way, rotated it counterclockwise, base tilted toward the breech instead of away. The movement was backward, wrong by every standard. But this time, it slid straight in, clean as a knife into water. The breech slammed shut. The gun thundered again. The smell of burnt propellant filled the turret, sweet and metallic. Johnson's stopwatch, taped above the radio, ticked down. 4.3 seconds. He did it again, counterclockwise, slide, lock, fire, 3.8 seconds. Outside, through the periscope, the commander saw the German tank across the hedgerow lurch sideways and stop moving. The Sherman had fired twice before the Panzer's gun even reloaded once. The others thought it was luck. Johnson knew it wasn't. He'd found something. The summer of 1944 had made France a graveyard of tanks. Patton's Third Army was pushing east through hedgerows near St-Lô, fields so tight they turned every fight into an ambush. The Sherman was never built for this kind of war. The manual said its 75mm at M3 gun could fire up to 20 rounds per minute, but that number only existed on paper. In combat, in the heat and chaos, crews managed 5 or 6 at best. Every extra second between shots was another second for a German gunner to find his mark. Panthers and Tigers could kill a Sherman at 500 meters. The Sherman's gun could barely punch through a Panther's front armor at half that range. The only advantage American crews had was speed. Speed to fire, speed to move, speed to live. But inside the turret, speed wasn't about courage. It was about angles. Johnson was 24, a dock worker from Savannah before the war. He'd spent his days hoisting steel drums and cargo crates, learning how to move weight efficiently, not forcefully. When he joined the Army, that skill followed him. The loader's position inside a Sherman was barely 3 feet wide. Every movement mattered. Where he stood, how far his arm traveled, how his wrist rotated when seating the round. The doctrine said to lift with both hands, rotate clockwise, and push the round into the breech as the gun returned from recoil. But the rotation, that single roll of the wrist, wasted nearly 2 seconds every cycle. It didn't matter in training. On a flat range, with the tank still and quiet, it worked fine. But under fire, when the turret rocked, when the hull tilted and smoke filled the air, that rotation turned against them. Johnson saw it during his first engagement near Avranches. His loader partner in another tank had missed a feed. The casing lip caught the guide rail, chipped the brass, and seized the breech shut. By the time they cleared it, a German 75mm shell had turned the tank into a torch. 4 men died in less than 10 seconds. He never forgot that. That night, he started timing himself. He'd stolen a stopwatch from a supply crate back in England and kept it in his pocket. While others played cards, he practiced loads. Round after round, dry drills by lantern light. The Army said a good loader could manage 6 rounds in a minute. He pushed for 10, then 11. But every time, the same problem slowed him down. The wrist roll. On August 10th, during a lull near Mortain, he tried something new. He flipped the shell on the rack so that its base pointed toward him instead of away. The orientation was wrong, completely reversed from the manual. But when he pulled it up and slid it forward, it entered the breech on a straighter line. The case lip met the guide perfectly. He could lift and load in one smooth arc instead of two. He wrote it down in his logbook. Reverse rotation, base up, wrist locked, save 2 seconds per round. The next morning, during a live fire exercise, he tested it under real recoil. The first 5 rounds loaded perfectly. The stopwatch read 3.9 seconds between shots. The gunnery sergeant watching from outside shook his head. He said the gunner must have been double tapping the trigger. Johnson didn't argue. He just wrote another note. Ergonomics before rules. 2 weeks later, that rule-breaking motion saved his crew. August 22nd, 1944, east of Argentan. The Sherman tank Dixie Belle was moving with the 2nd Armored Division, flanking German forces retreating toward the Seine. The roads were lined with wreckage, trucks, horses, burned-out half-tracks. The air smelled of diesel and scorched rubber. They were advancing fast, maybe too fast. The platoon hadn't refueled in 20 hours, and they were running low on ammunition. At 09:18, as they crested a ridge, a German ambush opened up from 600 yards ahead. 2 Panzer IV fired from hull-down positions, their first shells screaming overhead. The platoon scattered into cover. Dixie Belle braked hard behind a hedgerow, its tracks digging into the wet earth. Inside the turret, Johnson already had a shell in hand. He flipped it backward. Counterclockwise, straight motion, breech locked, fire. The tank rocked, the case ejected. He loaded again, 3 seconds flat. Another shot, then another. The Sherman fired 5 times in under 20 seconds. The first shell tore into a Panzer's track, locking it in place. The second hit its turret ring. The third, the one Johnson loaded blind through the smoke, hit the ammunition rack. The explosion lit the horizon. The second German tank turned to withdraw, but caught a round through its side armor before it could reverse. The entire engagement lasted 90 seconds. Afterward, the commander checked the spent casings on the turret floor and counted them twice. 5. He'd never seen a Sherman fire that fast without jamming. He asked what Johnson had done differently. Johnson didn't explain. He just stared at the empty breech and the smoke still hanging in the air. The story spread quietly. Some said Dixie Belle had been modified. Others said the gun was faulty, that it double-cycled. But the crews who saw it knew better. They'd heard the cadence, the rhythmic pulse of a gun firing faster than doctrine allowed. A week later, during maintenance checks, a staff NCO noticed something odd about Johnson's ready rack. The shells weren't facing the regulation direction. The bases pointed toward the loader's side instead of forward. The NCO marked it down as an error and ordered it fixed. Johnson reversed them again as soon as the inspection ended. By September, his method had a name: the backward shell rotation. Most thought it was a joke. A few tried it during drills and reported faster reloads, but commanders dismissed it as unsafe. Regulations said every loader had to follow the manual pattern. The Army valued uniformity more than innovation. That changed on October 3rd near Nancy. The division was pushing through heavy resistance, the roads choked with mud and wreckage. German armor was desperate, fighting from every ridge and farmyard. Johnson's crew had been in continuous combat for 3 days straight. The inside of the Sherman stank of sweat, grease, and cordite. The metal walls were black with residue. The recoil guard was dented from constant impacts. At 10:11 a.m., a Panther appeared through the smoke, 700 yards broadside. The Sherman fired once. Missed high. Johnson loaded again, 3.8 seconds. The second shot hit the turret base, ricocheted, and struck a fuel drum behind it. The explosion tore the Panther open. The tank's burning frame reflected off the Sherman's gun barrel like a torch in fog. By the end of that battle, Johnson's crew had fired 61 rounds in less than 10 minutes. The barrel was glowing red, the paint blistered, but they had survived. Word reached battalion command that evening. Someone started counting stopwatch times from combat reports. Crews using Johnson's loading sequence showed a 62% faster sustained rate of fire. Ammunition expenditure rose, but so did survival. In engagements where most Shermans were knocked out within 2 minutes, Those using the backwards load averaged 4. That difference was life. By mid-October 1944, the 2nd Armoured Division was closing on the German border. The pace of advance slowed as the terrain hardened. Narrow roads, deep forests, ambush country. The Shermans were exhausted, their engines coughing from clogged filters, their hulls scarred from near misses. But the crews had adapted. Inside those cramped steel coffins, every second counted. Desmond Johnson had become a quiet legend, not officially. No orders, no commendations. But in the mess tents and motor pools, crews whispered about the backwards loader from Dixie Belle. They said he could feed a 75mm faster than an autoloader. Mechanics tried to copy his technique, but most couldn't match it. The motion required precision, the right wrist angle, perfect timing, absolute confidence in the breech. Any hesitation, and the round would jam or bounce off the chamber lip. Johnson didn't teach it openly. He wasn't a reformer. He was a survivor. He knew the method broke regulation and that getting caught might mean losing his post, or worse, being blamed if someone got killed trying it. So he trained his replacement loaders in secret. At night, with the engine off, he'd walk them through the motion, base up, counterclockwise lift, shoulder pivot, one fluid shove. No roll, no pause, no wasted motion. He explained it the way he thought about it. The shell wasn't a weapon. It was a gear in a machine. The loader's job was to keep that machine in rhythm. When the rhythm broke, people died. That rhythm had already saved his crew more than once. In early November, near the Moselle River, the division encountered entrenched German armor north of Metz. It was freezing cold. Mud had frozen to steel, turning every tank tread into stone. Visibility was poor. They were ordered to hold a ridge while engineers built pontoon bridges below. At dawn, the first shell came in. It hit short, exploding in front of the ridge. A second followed. Then a third. The Germans were zeroing them in. Dixie Belle fired blind through the mist, Johnson loading as fast as muscle memory would allow. The gun cycled relentlessly. One shot, recoil, case ejected, next round already in hand. 3 seconds, 2.8, then 2.6. He'd never gone that fast before. After the battle, maintenance crews logged Dixie Belle's gun as overheating, breech scalded, chamber scratched, barrel dangerously worn. But the fire rate numbers in the after-action report made no sense. They indicated a sustained rate of fire twice the mechanical limit. Nobody believed it until they timed it themselves. A maintenance sergeant named Leonard Brooke ran stopwatch drills in a maintenance yard near Nancy. 3 Shermans, identical guns, crews drawn from the same battalion. 2 loaded standard. One used Johnson's backwards method. They fired alternating live and dummy rounds to measure cycle time. The results were immediate. Standard loaders averaged 5.8 seconds per round. Johnson's trainee, using the reverse rotation, averaged 2.9. Brooke ran the test 3 more times, same result. Half the time, double the rate. He wrote a report. Unorthodox loading procedure improves cadence by 47 to 58%. No modifications required, recommending field adoption, pending safety clearance. It never reached headquarters. The Ordnance Department rejected the submission outright, marking it improper deviation from Regulation TM 9731A. But the idea kept spreading. By late November, at least a dozen Sherman crews were using the technique unofficially. Some nicknamed it mirror loading because it reversed everything they'd been taught. Others just called it Desmond's trick. And everywhere it went, tanks started surviving longer. At the front, doctrine meant less than survival. During the Lorraine counteroffensive, the Germans launched a desperate assault, armor from the 11th Panzer Division striking hard through fog and sleet. The fighting was brutal and close. Visibility was down to 200 yards. Tanks fired point blank, through trees, through smoke. It was chaos. Johnson's platoon was pinned behind a ridge when 2 Panthers appeared to the right flank, moving fast, guns tracking. The Shermans fired first, missed. The Panthers fired back. The first round tore through the ground beside Dixie Belle, throwing dirt and shrapnel across the hull. The second exploded behind them, showering sparks into the turret. The commander called for smoke, but Johnson didn't wait. He had already loaded the next round before the breech had finished cycling. The gunner fired the instant the reticle settled. The shell hit the Panther's front plate, no penetration, but it staggered the driver. Johnson grabbed another. Same motion, same precision. The second hit the same spot. Armor fractured, the third ripped through, flames shot skyward, 2.4 seconds between shots. He didn't even realize it until later. That fight lasted 6 minutes. When it was over, Johnson's tank was covered in mud, streaked with oil, smoke still rising from the barrel. They'd destroyed 2 Panthers, damaged another, and held the ridge. The crew survived. So did the rhythm. After the battle, an ordnance inspector came to check the gun's breech timing. He found nothing unusual, except the loader's stopwatch, taped to the turret wall, still running. It read 00020938. In that span, they'd fired 37 shells. The inspector made a note of it. Weeks later, that note reached a research officer at Patton's Third Army headquarters. He flagged it as remarkable performance consistency. That phrase, and nothing else, became the only official acknowledgement of Desmond Johnson's work. The front didn't slow. The winter deepened. The Battle of the Bulge began in December. The 2nd Armoured was thrown north toward Bastogne to help contain the German advance. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Fuel lines froze. Shells jammed in racks slick with frost. Johnson's hands cracked and bled from cold, but he kept loading. The movement that once felt experimental was now instinct. Each round flowed through him like a reflex, body and machine fused. In one engagement west of March, his tank supported infantry pinned by a Tiger at 900 yards. The gunner's first 2 shells bounced harmlessly off the Tiger's sloped armor. Johnson loaded an armor-piercing capped round. The next shot hit the turret ring and stuck. The following round, 2.7 seconds later, struck the same spot and shattered the weld. The Tiger erupted from within, flames clawing through its hatches. When the smoke cleared, the infantry cheered. Johnson just stared at his hands. They were shaking, the skin blackened with powder residue, but steady when he reached for the next shell. No one in his crew called it luck anymore. By January 1945, Desmond Johnson's technique had crossed divisions. Reports trickled in from the 4th and 5th Armoured, describing Shermans firing faster than their mechanical limits. Maintenance logs called it operator variability. But tank crews knew exactly what it was. They were all using the backwards rotation. It wasn't written down in any manual. No officer had authorized it. It spread the only way real battlefield innovation ever does. Word of mouth, between men who wanted to live through the next fight. Johnson's name traveled with it, half myth, half secret. Crews said he'd figured it out by accident, others that he'd been a machinist who reversed the geometry of the breech by feel alone. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that it worked. And by now, everyone could see the results. In the 2nd Armoured Division, the average engagement survival rate for Shermans had risen from 3.1 minutes to 5.7. That seemed small, but in tank warfare, those 2 minutes meant life or death. A faster reload meant a faster correction shot. A faster correction shot meant a crippled Panther, not a dead crew. At a forward maintenance depot near Thionville, an ordnance officer named Captain Richard Groves began collecting field data from tank commanders. He noticed something peculiar. Every Sherman with a higher recorded rate of fire had minor scuffing on the left breech guide, an abrasion mark at a diagonal angle inconsistent with standard loading. When he interviewed the loaders, they said the same thing. "It's the Johnson rotation." Groves wrote a report for the Ordnance Technical Section. Field crews appear to be employing an unorthodox loading orientation that significantly improves feed rate. Tests suggest a reduction in shell hang-ups by over 70%. Recommend evaluation for doctrinal integration post-campaign. The memo never left France. Headquarters considered it anecdotal. But Groves didn't stop. He ordered time trials using live M61 armor-piercing rounds on an M4A3 Sherman testbed. 3 loaders, 10 cycles each. Standard rotation averaged 5.2 seconds. Reverse rotation averaged 2.8, identical accuracy. 0 jams. Groves recorded a short film of the test, shot with a handheld Bell and Howell. The footage showed nothing flashy, just a loader's motion, efficient and smooth, shells sliding in like clockwork. He labeled the reel Demonstration Counter-Rotation Load Method and mailed it to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland for study. It arrived in March 1945. By then, the war in Europe was nearly over. No one had the time or the inclination to rewrite doctrine for a war that was ending. The film sat on a shelf, unviewed, filed under experimental procedure. But the loader who'd started it all wasn't thinking about legacy. He was just trying to get his crew home. In February, the division crossed into Germany. The landscape was unrecognizable: blackened forests, frozen canals, empty towns stripped bare by months of retreat. The Sherman's engines coughed and sputtered in the cold. Ammunition convoys fell behind. Sometimes they fought with half loads, sometimes with scavenged rounds from wrecked tanks. On February 24th, outside the town of Prüm, Johnson's platoon ambushed a column of German armor retreating east. The first Panther went down to a side shot at 300 yards. The second swung its turret toward them, gun flash blooming orange. The Sherman's front armor caught the blast. A fist-sized crater punched through the glacis, showering the crew with fragments. Johnson's ears rang. His hand was bleeding, the skin torn by shrapnel, but he didn't stop. He gripped the next shell with his right hand only, flipped it backward, slammed it in. The gun fired. The recoil jolted him against the turret wall. Another shell, another shot, 5 rounds in 20 seconds. When the smoke cleared, both Panthers burned. The radio sputtered with static, then silence. Of the 5 tanks in Johnson's platoon, only 2 were left running, but they had survived. He never learned that his method had been recorded, measured, and proven by engineers hundreds of miles away. To him, it was just a motion, a rhythm born from survival. The war ended 2 months later. When the fighting stopped, he was 25 years old, worn down to 140 pounds, and half deaf in his left ear. The army discharged him with standard commendations: the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal, the Good Conduct Medal, and a Bronze Campaign Star. Nothing about the loading technique, nothing about the statistics. He went home to Georgia and found work at a foundry. He never spoke much about the war. When people asked, he said only that he'd been a loader. The army, however, remembered, quietly. In 1946, engineers at Aberdeen began studying loader fatigue and efficiency based on post-war field reports. They built mock turrets with adjustable ready racks and high-speed cameras to measure muscle motion. The conclusions matched Johnson's instinct perfectly. Standard wrist pronation caused micro-delays averaging 1.9 seconds per cycle. Reverse wrist lock with base-up alignment eliminated 90% of loading errors. The report recommended reversing the shell orientation in future turret designs and widening the loader's workspace by 2 inches to allow the straight-line motion Johnson had pioneered by accident. It was never credited to him. The report listed the innovation as anonymous field adaptation observed in late-war tank units. When the M46 Patton entered service in 1949, its ammunition racks were reoriented so that the loader's first grip mirrored Johnson's backwards method: base toward the loader, projectile pointed forward, no rotation required. The manuals described it as a streamlined feed sequence. Every tank after that, M47, M48, M60, kept it. In 1961, long after Johnson had retired, a military historian researching armored crew ergonomics stumbled upon a wartime photo from Metz. In it, a Sherman crew posed beside their tank, Dixie Belle, its gun barrel blackened from overuse. One man stood with his hand resting on a stopwatch taped inside the turret hatch. The caption read, "Corporal Desmond Johnson, 2nd Armored Division, France, 1944. The historian followed the trail, comparing after-action reports, maintenance notes, and the Aberdeen trials. The connections lined up perfectly. He wrote a paper titled, unrecognized efficiency modifications in armored warfare. It never made headlines, but within the tank community, the name Johnson rotation became a quiet reference to the loader's art, the understanding that the smallest physical motion could decide a battle. By the 1970s, the concept had evolved into a principle of design. When American engineers developed the XM-1 Abrams, they studied loader reach arcs and shell orientation using data derived from those same wartime reports. The Abrams loader, working under optimal conditions, could chamber a 120mm round in under 3 seconds. The ergonomic lineage led straight back to 1944. Johnson never knew. He died in 1983, buried in a small veteran cemetery outside Savannah. His headstone listed his unit, his rank, and a simple inscription. He kept the gun firing. But among tankers, his legacy persisted. They spoke of him not as a hero or an inventor, but as the embodiment of what war demanded: adaptation through necessity, precision through pain. In every armored museum, when instructors demonstrate turret loading drills, the movement looks ordinary now. Straight lift, forward push, no rotation. That efficiency, invisible and unquestioned, was once a defiant act inside a burning tank in Normandy. In 1989, 6 years after Desmond Johnson's death, a curator from the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen uncovered a rusted steel crate labeled Miscellaneous Field Film, 1945. Inside were reels of footage from the European theatre, maintenance tests, turret drills, field experiments. Among them was a short, silent film marked simply Counter-Rotation Loading Groves. The curator threaded it through a projector and switched off the lights. The grainy black and white image flickered to life. There was a Sherman tank turret, stripped open to show the crew at work. A man in fatigues stood where the loader would be, stopwatch ticking. The film showed him lifting a 75mm shell, not the way manuals described, but reversed, base angled upward, shoulder pivoting smoothly. The round slid home, the breech locked, and a plume of smoke burst from the muzzle. The film slowed, replaying the same motion in sequence. Straight lift, half turn, feed. The entire cycle lasted less than 3 seconds. At the end, a hand appeared in frame holding a clipboard. Scrawled across the page were 3 words in pencil: Johnson Method Verified. Nobody knew who had written it, but it confirmed what field reports had only hinted. The curator included the footage in a small museum exhibit about soldier-borne innovations, alongside other field modifications: spare track welded for armor, fuel lines rerouted by hand, improvised radios built from scavenged parts. Visitors rarely stopped to watch. It was just another forgotten piece of film about a tank loader's odd trick, but for the few engineers who studied it, it was revolutionary. They realized that Johnson's backward shell rotation wasn't just faster, it reduced fatigue exponentially. The straight-line motion eliminated torque on the loader's wrist and shoulder. Over dozens of cycles, that difference allowed a single loader to sustain a rate of fire other crews couldn't match without rest. It wasn't brute strength that had doubled the Sherman's rate of fire. It was ergonomics, decades before anyone used that word. By the 1990s, Johnson's principle had quietly entered design philosophy. Every new armored vehicle built by NATO engineers incorporated lessons drawn from field ergonomics: the angle of ammunition racks, the slope of breech guides, the alignment of the loader's elbow to the recoil plane. All of it came from patterns noticed first in 1944, and yet no official record credited him. The Army's doctrine manuals listed the improvement under operational efficiency adjustments, citing only anonymous field loaders in 2nd Armored Division. It was bureaucracy's way of hiding genius behind procedure. In 2004, the curator's footage resurfaced in a documentary called Steel and Sweat: The Human Engineering of War. It ran late on a cable channel few watched, but the director, a military historian himself, included a line near the end. The loader shown here was believed to be Desmond Johnson, a corporal whose unorthodox grip cut reload times in half and may have saved hundreds of tank crews from destruction. His method was never officially adopted, only quietly imitated. For the first time, his name was spoken aloud on film. After the broadcast, a group of retired tankers from the 2nd Armored Association petitioned to have Johnson recognized for battlefield innovation. The Army reviewed the request but found no surviving paperwork, no written order, no official acknowledgement from wartime command. Without documentation, the board declined. The letter they sent to the veterans ended with, "While not formally credited, Corporal Johnson's contribution is recognized in spirit." The phrase stung, but it was the closest thing to justice his name ever got. Today, every modern main battle tank, from the Abrams to the Leopard 2, uses a loading configuration based on the same principle. Minimal wrist rotation, direct line chambering, shortest path between ammunition rack and breech. Crews are trained that way without realizing it's the product of a single moment of instinct, born inside a shaking steel turret 80 years ago. In museums, Shermans are painted clean and quiet, their scars replaced with polish. But for anyone who's been inside one, the reality never leaves. The smell of burnt powder, the scrape of brass on steel, the rhythmic thud of recoil that feels like the heartbeat of survival. Somewhere in that rhythm, Desmond Johnson's discovery still lives. He wasn't an officer or an engineer. He didn't write reports or seek recognition. He just found a better way to do his job, and that better way saved lives. It's easy to forget that wars aren't only won by strategy or firepower. Sometimes they're won by the smallest details: the angle of a wrist, the turn of a shell, the refusal to waste a single second when every second meant survival. That was his gift. The quiet efficiency of a man who never stopped thinking, even under fire. When people visit his grave now, they see a simple headstone. No rank beyond corporal, no decoration beyond the campaign star. But underneath those carved words lies the truth. He was the loader who changed the rhythm of war. And every time a tank fires twice before the enemy fires once, his legacy echoes through steel and smoke, uncredited, unseen, but undeniable.